Hi everyone, welcome to video 15. Um, I've already mentioned this, but do feel free to pause. You don't have to watch these videos all the way through, but I got to the point that I had to take a break. So, welcome back. I'm going to start up with foreign policy, the end of the president, presidential powers talk. The Constitution makes foreign policy strictly the domain of the president with the advice and consent of the Senate in almost all cases. The roles for other uh, branches of government or the full Congress, including the House of Representatives, um, is pretty limited. Uh, so when I say this, why do I say this? Um, this is because the president makes all the appointments with the advice and consent of the Senate, and any treaty negotiations are done with the advice and consent of the Senate. This leaves a fairly limited role for other things. There are some, but it is mostly the idea is the president is the face of U.S. foreign policy. So, what are some of the goals of foreign policy? Uh, Before we talk about the goals, we need to kind of have an idea of what foreign policy is. Foreign policy is the programs and policies that affect our relationships with other nations, or the programs and policies regarding our relationships with other nations. This includes a lot of specific things because it's all of the programs and policies. So it starts with diplomacy, which is kind of the face that most people think of immediately as, oh, the ambassadors that are diplomatic relations. It also includes military relations. Military relations do not have to be negative. This includes our security agreements with other countries uh, for defense, for strictly defensive purposes. Um, Diplomacy also can involve trade, but there can also be, and this is where Congress maybe comes into it, not just the Senate, is we have trade policies. So policies like tariffs and other policies that can affect trade. They can either be barriers to trade or they can make trade easier. And negotiating those agreements affecting trade is the president and the Senate. Although the whole Congress can give something called fast track authority, but but trade comes into it. Aid to foreign countries, of course, comes into it, and we do a fair amount of that. Um, and then there are even more other things that can be involved with foreign policy, things like international finance and the relationships or regulation of multinational corporations, both American corporations abroad and foreign corporations here. Uh, Foreign policy primarily deals with nation states, but not entirely. So some of the big actors are the other countries in the world. But we also deal with a lot of nation state, non-state actors. I just mentioned multinational corporations. We have to deal with with both the regulations for both our companies when they are working abroad and foreign companies when they come here. There are issues with following local laws. There are issues with international law with multinational corporations, and there are issues with taxation. How is taxation handled? Is it in the country where they're doing business? Is it in their home country? Is there an interaction? Is it some of each? Um, Non-governmental organizations are another area. So non-governmental organizations here, I'm talking about primarily nonprofit organizations. You can think of organizations like Doctors Without Borders, the International Red Cross and Red Crescent, um, other kinds of international non-governmental organizations. These are typically organizations doing humanitarian work. Some of them are associated with the international organizations that I'll get to, associated with them, but not actually part of them. Uh, Non-state armed groups we have to deal with. These are rebel and terrorist groups because they cause security problems. Sometimes the United States attacks rebel and terrorist groups, especially terrorist groups. Sometimes we attack rebel groups to help our allies. Sometimes we support rebel groups uh, when they oppose governments that we oppose, typically dictatorships. Um, well, in fact, so far as I know, entirely dictatorships, at least in the last 30 years or so. Organized crime groups actually are a foreign policy issue because organized crime groups cross borders. Um, the one of the early 20th century organized crime groups in the United States that became very powerful during Prohibition, when alcohol was prohibited in the country, was the mafia, and this was the Sicilian mafia. Uh, Actually, all of the members were either recent immigrants or children or grandchildren of immigrants from Sicily, and they had ties to the island of Sicily in the Mediterranean. Even the organized crime group itself was active there and had ties to its American arm. Um, More recently, the Russian mafia became big in the United States after the fall of the Soviet Union. A Russian mafia grew up here. There have been mafias, and that mafia is actually the Sicilian mafia, but that ended up being a phrase that was used for other group or a word used for other groups. And lots of different international organized crime groups have shown up in the United States. The latest threat has been from a couple of Central and South American organized crime groups that are involved in the drug trade um, primarily. So, and also somewhat in human trafficking uh, and human slavery. So, so, so the government there is largely, this is not. Uh, so when we negotiate with nation states, it's usually for cooperation and for positive purposes. Sometimes it's over military conflict. Um, with organized crime groups, we're talking about suppressing organized crime being a major foreign policy goal. And so the organized crime groups often require that we help other nation states. If we want to deal with an organized crime group that is coming out of, for example, El Salvador, as one of them was, we cooperate with the government of El Salvador to try to solve that problem. International organizations include things like the United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. So international organizations are organizations that are that are formed by written agreements for specific purposes between nation states. So the United Nations was formed by the UN Charter, which was a treaty that was signed by the United States and every other member of the United Nations. The same for any international organization. That's the definition of them. So if it's some kind of organization that doesn't involve an agreement between states, uh, between nation states, then it comes under the category of a non-governmental organization. So that's why some of the organizations that the United Nations has within it don't have their own separate agreement, and so they're considered non-governmental organizations. Uh, so what are the goals of U.S. foreign policy specifically? These are sort of in order of importance. If any of you have done any psychology work, you may have come across the idea of a hierarchy of needs, and specifically Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And this hierarchy of needs is a pyramid that shows sort of the most important things that you have to do as a person to take care of yourself are the physical things, providing yourself shelter, food, water, probably clothing, um, just very basic things, and security from wild animals and from other people. Until you do those things, you can't start to do the things that you would like to do, like socializing, entertainment, um, and ultimately at sort of the top of this pyramid of needs, this hierarchy is getting to the point where you can become self-actualized. That is, being the best person you can be. Well, with foreign policy, it's kind of the same. We have to take care of the physical needs first. And so the security of the U.S. is the primary goal of U.S. foreign policy. Security for the U.S., according to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and all of the other founding documents, securing the rights of American citizens is what government is for. And so securing one of those rights is the right to life and liberty, and another one's the right to property. And securing those rights is why we have government in the first place. So security for I say security for the US. What I mean here really is security for the rights of US citizens. That's the primary job of the government. So it's certainly the primary US foreign policy consideration. Uh, and then also the security of our allies, because the more secure our allies can be, number one, the more they're going to look out for our security if we need it, and the less likely opposition, rivals are going to challenge them or us. Um, and so that basic security for American citizens is also the thing that has to happen as the lowest level of this hierarchy of needs for a nation. The second, maybe most important thing in that hierarchy of needs is also a physical thing, and that is prosperity, economic growth, access to resources to be able to make things, to be able to make growth happen, access to markets so that our businesses have places to sell things. And this access isn't about going out and sending the U.S. Army to go out and take over other countries in order to steal their resources. It's about negotiating access to buy resources at market prices. The same with selling U.S. things in foreign markets. It's about getting access for American businesses to sell to willing buyers in foreign markets. It's not about making anybody buy or sell anything to the U.S. generally. Now, in the 1800s, in the case of Japan, the access to markets thing was gained with the use of a warship. It didn't come down to any actual battles or anything, so it could have been worse, but it was not entirely peaceful. Uh, but that was more the exception than the rule. The typical thing is that we like to negotiate access to resources so our businesses can buy things and access to markets so our businesses can sell things, also that Americans can be more prosperous because just like the psychology hierarchy of needs, where you have to have food and water before you can worry about self-actualization, we have to actually have resources and be able to do the last thing, which is Americans do make it a goal of our foreign policy to have a better world. Some of this is just American idealism. I don't want to paint it as all being completely altruistic idealism, but it's also not accurate it would also not be accurate to say that yes, Americans have idealistic views of foreign policy. We do actually believe in things like human rights and democracy. We spend a lot of time on democracy promotion. Does this benefit us? Absolutely. It benefits us too, um, but it is also something we believe in. It's sort of what you would call a win-win situation in a lot of cases. And sometimes though, it is not really a benefit to us. It is just we're following what we believe. Um, we believe in peaceful resolution of disputes. That does not mean we aren't willing to use force if it comes to it, but our preference is peaceful resolution of disputes. And our preference, we're so in favor of peaceful resolution of disputes that we are willing to intervene on behalf of countries that are defending themselves, like Kuwait when it was defending itself against Iraq in 1990 and 91. So, or when we've provided resources to the Ukraine to do, we haven't provided military troops, but we provided resources to Ukraine to defend itself after it was attacked. Uh, Environmental protection is an American. It is an American ideal. The U.S. has joined some treaties. That's not the biggest thing that the U.S. does for environmental protection. Despite anything you have heard to the contrary, the United States is a leader in environmental regulations within our own country. The United States has um, reduced its carbon emissions in absolute terms and in terms of carbon units per tons of carbon per unit of production, which is a very important measure. So the U.S. engages in environmental protection, sometimes human rights and labor rights that start in the United States and environmental protection things that start in the United States spread to other countries just by the fact that those other countries want access to our resources and our markets. And so they raise their own standards as part of trade. Um, and the US is a major contributor to international organizations. Depending on the organization, organizations we belong to, we typically contribute anywhere from 20 to 35 or 40% of their budget. Um, so this is not unusual for us to be the largest contributor to the budget, in spite of the fact that out of 8 billion people, we're only 330 million. So we are nowhere near the largest country. China and India both have 1.3 billion people, and their contributions are a fraction of ours. So I'm going to give you a little about security policies throughout history. So this is mostly U.S. security policies, but some of it is our allies or other countries, or us with our allies in other countries. So before World War I, and then again after World War II, the primary U.S. security policy was to rely on our physical isolation to protect us from the politics of mostly Europe. The major threat to the U.S. would have been being drawn into a European war. Um, so we used the fact that we have two oceans and that we have always, with very few exceptions, gotten along fairly well with Canada. And we have, with no major wars since 1812, and we have gotten along substantially well with Mexico, but we've had some conflict. But there's been nobody, but Mexico and Canada were neither ever big enough a country to seriously threaten us, and we had the oceans separating us from Europe. Um, so we just relied on it, and they called it isolationism. It wasn't really isolationism, and I'm going to tell you two reasons it wasn't isolationism. First of all, the US was always trading with other countries, so it was strictly security isolation. Secondly, it wasn't absolute security isolation. First of all, the US, under Thomas Jefferson, sent warships to put down the Barbary pirates uh, in the area of Tripoli in the Mediterranean. Uh, Secondly, we were not isolated from the Western Hemisphere, the other countries of North and South America. From the presidency of James Monroe, we got the Monroe Doctrine that basically told Europe not to interfere in the Americas, and that we were going to put our troops, our ships, everything else behind, keeping Europe from interfering in the Americas. This was an anti-colonial um, rule, an anti-colonial doctrine of U.S. security. Um, I realized that being in one of the countries that was the exception to America's opposition to colonialism, it may be this may be something that you are not aware of. The U.S. was largely opposed to colonialism. Being former colonies, the first 13 American states were former colonies of Britain and had to fight a war of revolution and were generally supportive of other countries uh, shaking off colonialism. It wasn't really until the Spanish-American War, that the U.S., as a result of the Spanish-American War, ended up gaining substantial colonial territories, and so it was outside. It was outside the normal realm, and the Spanish-American War was a result of, at least partially, that Monroe Doctrine. It was Spanish interference in the Caribbean that caused the U.S. to go to war against Spain. What about before World War II? So before World War II, the U.S. was back to practicing isolationism, and Europe, uh, other than Germany and Italy, uh, were either neutral or practicing something called appeasement. And so Hitler rearmed Germany in violation of the treaties that were signed at the end of World War I. And the initial response of the other European powers was to ignore that, to let him rebuild his military. As he rebuilt his military, he began making territorial demands. He annexed Austria, and by just sending his soldiers marching in on the basis that Austria spoke German and should be part of Germany. Um, the other European powers let him do this. He demanded the Sudetenland that was part of Czechoslovakia on the basis that German minorities there were being uh, harassed, and the other powers allowed it. Eventually, he took all of Czechoslovakia, and the other powers allowed it. After the Munich conference, when Hitler had made one of his demands and they had given in, Neville Chamberlain came back to Britain. He was the Prime Minister of Britain, came back saying that he had found peace for our time. Uh, a short time later, that peace disintegrated when the Soviet Union and Germany conspired to attack Poland and divide it between the two great powers. At that point, France and Britain entered war against Germany in defense of Poland. Um, in 1939, the U.S. was still not involved. We were still isolationist. When the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in 1941, the United States entered the war um, on the side of the Allies, France and Britain and the other allies. At some point, the Soviets had a falling out with Nazi Germany and joined the Allies. Um, excuse me. And the nationalist government of China was also one of the Allies, having been attacked by the Japanese um, in pretty brutal ways. Uh, After World War II, the United States realized that in an increasingly interconnected world, isolationism was not going to work. It was possible for planes to cross the Pacific in a matter of hours, for ships to cross the Pacific or the Atlantic under power in a matter of days. And the world had just become much smaller. Communication was much faster with radio and telegraph, um, that it was not the 1800s anymore, and we had to watch out for our security. On top of that, first the Soviet Union and later Maoist China directly threatened the United States because of their Marxist ideology that was dedicated to taking over the entire world. It was their stated goal. So the first policy was containment, which was holding the communist bloc to the countries that it already controlled. So this meant specifically defending Western Europe against the Soviet Union, and short time later defending Asia against Maoist China. Secondly, we had a policy of deterrence. At the first, this meant the Soviet Union had a large army. Europe did not have large armies because World War II had been so devastating that they were trying to rebuild and did not have the resources to sustain armies large enough to repel the Soviets. It was pretty well established that if it came down to a military conflict with the Soviets trying to take over Western Europe, they could roll through Western Europe in a matter of weeks and take it over. The US kept troops posted there, but the number of troops posted in Western Europe was not sufficient to stop the Soviets. It was sufficient to act as a tripwire. That tripwire would do two things. First, it would start up the American war machine that had won World War II back into action to free Europe again. But number two, the United States at this point was the only country with nuclear weapons, and it was assumed the United States would use them sooner rather than later if the Soviets attacked. Later, when the Soviet Union got nuclear weapons of its own, the deterrence became a policy of making sure that we had enough nuclear and conventional weapons that they could not win a war, and that they would suffer consequences sufficient to deter them from starting one. Uh, The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. This did not necessarily make Russia a friendly country, but it made it less threatening than it had been, especially after many of the former Soviet republics left the Soviet Union and became independent countries, some of them democratic, some of them not. So we ended up in a new in a new security policy starting right around 1991. It started with the first Gulf War when Kuwait was attacked by Iraq and annexed. Iraq wanted the Kuwaiti oil fields, and the U.S., because we adopted this new doctrine of collective action and restraint, we defended Kuwait. We did it under the United Nations Security Council resolution with over 70 allies, and expelled Iraq from Kuwait in support of the principle of the United Nations Charter making wars of aggression illegal. Iraq had committed a war of aggression against Kuwait to steal its oil, and we backed them down and got them out, along with a large number of allies under the United Nations. So the idea was it was collective action with allies, and restraint. We didn't do it on our own. We didn't just go in immediately and do it. There were later, and I'll say with regard to this collective action and restraint, and something else I said about access to resources earlier, a lot of people that called this a war for oil. Well, when Iraq took over Kuwait, it was to take over those oil fields for themselves. That was a war for oil. When the United States freed Kuwait, the United States turned it right back over to its original government. The United States never stayed and took oil. There was no war for oil. We did get access to the oil fields, but actually we could have had access to the oil fields if Iraq owned them, if we had asked. Iraq was perfectly willing to sell us the oil, so that wasn't the issue. It was collective action and restraint in support of the United Nations Charter's ban on wars of aggression. Um, Later, there were NATO actions in former Yugoslavia, us with our NATO allies, when when Yugoslavia was falling apart and there were civil wars, civil conflict, and genocide happening in Yugoslavia, there were times when we, with our European allies, stepped in to help. And that help, including military action. Uh, there was NATO action in Libya later. We joined in that, which ultimately led to Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi losing power. Uh, then, under George W. Bush, the idea of preventive war was brought in, which was the idea that a war of self defense could include a war of prevention, that we did not have to wait, that if someone is threatening to strike you, you don't have to wait for them to throw the first punch. Uh, because in a world where nuclear weapons exist, the first punch could be a nuclear punch, and you don't have to wait for that. So that was, and I will talk shortly about the Bush Doctrine, but that was preventive war, and that started with the invasion of Iraq in 2003. So that's a summary basically of our security policies. Um, some of our other foreign policy goals. So I talked about these earlier. Environmental policy. We do have environmental policy goals. Um, our environmental policy goals, the thing about the United States is, and this is not just a presidential thing. This is something that Congress has passed into law, and that the Senate has passed in resolutions that have never been repealed. Um, Whatever environmental policy we negotiate elsewhere has to be fair economically to the United States. So, environmental treaties that are negotiated multilaterally by a lot of governments that allow exceptions for major polluters like China um, violate U.S. Senate resolutions and U.S. law. So it's not that the United States is against good environmental policy, it's that US policy is that we want environmental policy that is fair to everyone. The US takes a major role in human rights policy. We take this seriously. It's not that there are never problems in the United States. We have some things we would like to do better, but we are not egregious violators of human rights generally when we talk about human integrity rights. So that is bodily integrity. That's the major definition of human rights. And um, we try to take a leadership role in in developing treaties, in negotiating with other countries that are um, when we negotiate with other countries that are known abusers of human rights, we set conditions on things like giving them access to our markets. We set conditions on foreign aid in order to encourage better human rights policies. And there have been times that we have used force uh, to uh, to deal with, among other things, human rights abuses. It's one of the things that's been a consideration, for example, in some of the NATO actions I just referred to. We have foreign policy goals of peacekeeping. When a conflict is settled, whether it's a civil conflict, a civil war, or an international conflict, the United States contributes to peacekeeping through the United Nations or on an individual basis. We contribute peacekeeping troops. Um, and we have a huge foreign policy goal of expanding markets, which, on the one hand, is part of that foreign policy goal of prosperity for U.S. citizens. It is also part of our idealism uh, that we know empirically, factually, it's been proven that freer trade increases the general welfare for all trading partners. That does not mean that there are not losses in specific market sectors in each country, but free trade overall produces more benefit than harm, um, and it's actually much more benefit than harm. And so expanding markets is something that, yeah, absolutely, it's good for us, but it's good for the people we trade with as well. And so that's been a major foreign policy goal of the United States for a long time, and hopefully will continue to be a goal of the United States for a while. Who makes American foreign policy? So the number one answer is the president and close advisors make foreign policy. In the bureaucracy, there are large groups of people working in the State Department, which is the Foreign Policy Department, the Defense Department, which is the military department, and the various intelligence agencies, especially the Central Intelligence Agency, that all advise the president on foreign policy, directly or indirectly. This is what these departments do, large parts of these departments. The other key players are mostly all of them, well, limited to influencing the president. Congress influences the president through, uh, and so I'm speaking here about Congress generally because the Senate has more of a role. Congress generally influences the president through um, its role in legislation, its role in oversight, and its role in funding. The courts rarely interfere with presidents in areas of foreign policy. The most important role of the courts is that any treaty signed by a president and confirmed by the Senate is the law of the land. It's second only to the Constitution, and the courts in the United States enforce that. So the biggest role of foreign policy is the courts. Role of the courts is their role in enforcement of treaty law. Um, Political parties, interest groups, and trade associations, their primary goal or their primary influence is just persuasive influence over the president. If any of these represent large numbers of people, um, their opinions matter to the president politically. If but that is it. That is generally their role. The president may, in some cases, call on members of these interest groups or leaders of these interest groups, and I'm just going to refer to these all as interest groups, may call on them to tell, what are your members thinking? What do your members believe on this? And so they can have influence, but that's their role, is influence and advice. Um, so the Bush Doctrine, I told you about. This is a little more about it. The idea is there's no need to wait for a first strike. They specifically said there's no need to find a smoking gun before acting. So that was the actual thing. This is probably more important to American students that are going to hear some misinformation about this doctrine. But the doctrine said you don't have to wait for a first strike. You don't have to wait for evidence like a smoking gun, because if you wait for that, it's too late. And this justified. So the action in Afghanistan was mostly justified by support for the Taliban by the Afghani government, but the Iraq war, well, was justified on this basis of preventive or preemptive action. Um, so the president's role, and this is an example of the president's role in creating foreign policy. This is the most recent creation of a new, strongly articulated security doctrine. Was the Bush doctrine. Presidents since have tinkered at the edges of the Bush doctrine, but it's never been formally repealed, and there's not really a strong security doctrine that's come in to replace it. Um, to the extent that things have disagreed with this, it's mostly gone back to the collective action and restraint of George H.W. Bush and a little bit of tinkering around the edges. So, what are some of the president's not are some of the what are some of the president's powers here? So, I'm sorry, the not a law is wrong here. It's a I was going for something else, so I'm going to explain that. But executive agreements partially bypass Congress. They're not treaties. They're agreements between the executive branches of governments. They have legal effect. Um, since the 1930s, the Supreme Court has recognized them as having legal effect, uh, but they lack the political and constitutional strength of a treaty, which is signed by the president and approved by two-thirds of the Senate. According to the Constitution, treaties are the supreme law of the land, so they are second only to the Constitution. The fact that they're approved by two-thirds of the Senate not only gives them legal power and constitutional power, but it gives them great political power because it takes a lot to get two-thirds of senators to agree on something. It's going to take senators from both parties supporting something for a treaty to be approved. And so while its legal effect may not be much greater than an executive agreement, it is much more firmly um, It is much more firmly in the law. The second reason it's a much more important legally is that an executive agreement, just like an executive order, can be withdrawn from by the next president. So if one president signs something as an executive agreement and ratifies it as an executive agreement, not with Senate approval, it's binding in international law between the countries, and it's binding domestically, but the next president can end it um, because the Senate didn't do the job of approving it. The bureaucracy, their role is developing the information that the president has to make decisions. The major people involved are the secretaries of state, defense, and treasury, and all the people that work for them. Um, the Department of Treasury has a role in enforcing American goals. This Department of Treasury can actually deny access to international payment systems to people that have been sanctioned. So someone who's been sanctioned by the U.S. president, he signs an order. The Department of the Treasury can make it very hard for that person to access assets and to move money through the international financial system, even in places outside the United States, because of the United States' power in the international financial system. The Joint Chiefs of Staff are the generals representing each of the branches of the military who plan American military action and provide options to the president as needed. The CIA director is involved in all of the intelligence or spying of the United States and provides intelligence briefings to the United States president. The National Security Council is a group of security advisors who work for the president in the White House in the White House and the Executive Office building and provide direct advice to the president. These are people who are chosen by the president who match his political goals and his foreign policy goals. Congress as foreign policy maker, and so here I'm talking about both houses together, House of Representatives and Senate. Their role has increased since WW2, World War II. Um, they use their oversight role and their budget role to become sometimes very involved in specific areas of foreign policy. They will question people like the Secretary of State, the undersecretaries and assistant secretaries of state about things the State Department is doing, about formulating foreign policy, about what the foreign policy is, and about how it's carried out. And because of their role in the budget process, they can exert influence over the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of the Treasury, and the intelligence agencies. So they have an oversight role, and quite often their oversight role verges on taking part in the management of the agencies. So that there may be some argument even that at times Congress may step on executive branch toes in their oversight role. What about some of those interest groups? So interest groups can include everything from economic groups like labor unions or corporations or groups of corporations. Associations representing different industries, to ethnic and national groups. Specific ethnic groups within the country when within the United States that may be related to people in another country ethnically may try to influence foreign policy towards that country. And this can go a couple of ways. The Cuban American community in the United States is strongly opposed to the current government in Cuba, and so typically opposes concessions to the Cuban government. Although recently they have started to favor some changes in the relations, including some more travel being allowed. But But the Cuban Americans are strongly opposed to the Cuban government. On the other hand, Irish Americans during the time of the Troubles in Northern Ireland managed to keep the United States almost neutral between our closest ally, Britain, and the Irish Republican Army, which was a terrorist group. The Irish Republican Army was even able at times to recruit and collect funds in the United States, which under the War on Terror, we would just not tolerate from any other country. But they managed to do it here because the Irish community is big enough and politically influential enough, or big enough to be politically influential. Um, Human rights groups Amnesty International is a big one. Environmental groups, Greenpeace, has influence over U.S. environmental policy. Amnesty International has influence, and both of these groups have influence over both foreign and domestic policy. Uh, Amnesty International is not shy about mentioning specific times when the United States is not living up to our own standards on human rights, and sometimes we fail to do that. Greenpeace is not shy about pointing out when the United States does not live up to our own standards on environmental groups, and sometimes we do that. But they have some influence. So I want to talk briefly about the instruments of modern American foreign policy, and where I'm going to go here may surprise you, and then again it may not, since many Americans don't know this, but I think maybe many people in other countries are more aware of it. Diplomacy. Diplomacy is obvious. We use representation to other governments. We use sometimes we act as diplomatic mediators between other governments or between governments and non-state actors. We have a role in providing ambassadors and consuls and others uh, who handle our relationships with other governments. Sometimes this gets really overshadowed by major events. Um, so so there are times when we may not see the diplomacy because uh, we see the trade war or we see the conflict. But that doesn't mean diplomacy is not in the background shaping things. One of those things, though, that can often overshadow diplomacy, although it often also works in the background, is the post, and I said post Cold War. This is the post World War II liberal order. This is actually the liberal order that existed during the Cold War and after. So this is the post war liberal order, post World War II. The United Nations so the United Nations and UN, the Security Council consists of the US, the UK, France, Russia, and China. It was originally nationalist China, which meant that it was an alliance. It was our allies, the US, the UK, France, and China, plus our former ally during World War II, Russia, or the Soviet Union, which had become our adversary. Um, Later, uh, in an attempt to help isolate Russia or to counterbalance Russia, we stopped recognizing the nationalist Chinese, the Republic of China, and recognized the People's Republic of China and allowed the People's Republic of China to become the Security Council representative. So at that point, it was the free market democratic US, UK, and France, the somewhat liberalizing Chinese, and Russia. Um, Around that time, uh, China had acquired nuclear weapons, and so it was also, at that time, it was the five nuclear powers. There are now more nuclear powers, but those five were the Security Council members. The General Assembly of the UN consists of every country in the world. Um, the international financial institutions, the World Bank, whose job is uh, economic development and poverty reduction. And it loans money to countries, to developing countries for those purposes. The International Monetary Fund is responsible for the currency stability. That is the stability of currencies in all countries, and of that portion of the international financial system in order to prevent large-scale contagious currency collapse that could lead to serious economic consequences all over the globe. Trade agreements, starting with the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, the GATT, which eventually evolved into the World Trade Organization, um, and regional agreements to expand free trade. And then we also entered into security arrangements, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, and other collective security agreements with other countries. All of these things, all of these things, the United States was instrumental in starting, was an original member of, and has used as elements of U.S. foreign policy. The post World War II liberal order is the order that the United States wanted to happen. It favors democracies and it favors free trade. It, it has favored the security of the United States. It has aided the security of the United States, and it has helped the United States to become even richer than it was at the end of World War II. Some Americans think that the post-Cold War, or I'm sorry, the post-World War II liberal order has cost the United States money or resources or security, and nothing could be further from the truth. All of these institutions ultimately got started as and have been used as tools of U.S. foreign policy. Does that mean they are bad things? It does not. The World Bank's purpose is poverty reduction and economic development. Now, it has made mistakes that have caused problems, but its basic purpose is good and it has achieved a lot of good. The International Monetary Fund helped prevent the complete breakdown of international finance at the time of the Asian currency crisis. It helped stop the breakdown of the international financial system during the 2008 and 2009 financial crisis. Um, the trade agreements coming out of the World Trade Organization and other things have helped massively reduce poverty worldwide. The number of people living in absolute poverty has gone down tremendously, and a lot of this, while some of it is due to political agreements and to foreign aid, a huge amount of it is just due to expanded world trade. I'm sure that I'm sure that you've seen examples of this, um, where, or if you do some research, you can see examples of this where areas that you're probably familiar with have not just because of trade with the United States, but because of increased trade with countries near you, have become wealthier and better developed than they were, even 20 or 30 years ago, and it's benefited the United States too. We're just kind of blind to it. We don't see it. But yeah, those have been tools of American foreign policy. But that American foreign policy, remember, yes, we're worried about security. Yes, we're worried about our own prosperity. And yes, these things help that. But we also do have some desire to make the world a better place. And so these have helped with that too. And if we can do both, uh, you know, from my perspective, great. Sometimes certainly other people question how much of it is, other people in other countries may question how much of it is us doing better for ourselves and how much is helping them. But I think in most of these cases, both are happening. And in some cases, uh, with the World Bank and the IMF, there are times when it's more about helping other people than it is about helping ourselves. Not always. There are some definite ways we've used it to help ourselves. Um, Major foreign policy issues for the U.S. now. First of all, Major powers. We have to be worried about China's power, China's rising power. It has rising military and economic power. Um, China has 1.3 billion people. We have 330 million. China's technology is taking off. It still lags ours, but not by much, maybe by a couple of years. I mean, in some ways, they may be ahead of us. Um, their military is still smaller than ours. Their military budget is still much smaller than ours, but they have the manpower that if they use the budget, they can have a much bigger military than ours. Um, so military power, rising military power from China is an issue, and the way they're going to fund that rising military power is with their rising economic power. Does that mean that the proper response to China is military or antagonistic or to reduce their economic power? Not necessarily. The post-Cold War liberal order may give us some ideas for how to deal with that in a cooperative fashion. And there are some other things that may give us some ideas. But dealing with China's rise and the potential that China could be a military threat to the United States is the biggest single thing we've got. The second biggest single thing we've got is blunting Russia's ambitions in Europe. The entire the entire deterrence part of the early Cold War was all about stopping Russia from taking over Western Europe. They called it the Soviet Union, but the capital was in the same place, and the ambitions were the same. They were called Marxist, and now they're called, Russian nationalism, but the ambitions were the same, and the motivations were actually largely the same. So, uh, stopping Russia's ambitions for its expansion in Europe are our second biggest issue. Our third biggest issue is nuclear proliferation and other weapons of mass destruction. North Korea already has nuclear weapons and can hit U.S. territories and the state of Hawaii in the Pacific and can probably hit the mainland United States, although not with any accuracy. But with nuclear weapons, not having accuracy actually makes them worse because it means they're more likely to hit civilian targets. Um, Iran is working on getting nuclear weapons, and it has delivery systems because it has a big missile program. Terrorists are involved with this because if terrorists somehow get a hold of nuclear devices or even just nuclear materials, they can cause all kinds of problems, up to and including uh, either nuclear bombs or dirty bombs contaminated with nuclear material going off in cities, targeting civilians and killing anywhere from thousands to hundreds of thousands at a single time. Uh, Trade is a huge foreign policy issue. The U.S. has, since the mid 20th century and really even the early 20th century, favored more trade, more open trade, better access to markets, better access to resources for us, and being perfectly willing uh, to uh, you know give access to our markets in order to get that. The current U.S. administration um, seems to be taking a different tack, and the previous Biden administration did not seem to be as concerned about it as um, we might have expected. So we don't know as Americans where this one is going. Um, is the basic answer. But we know the great benefits of trade, and so hopefully it is generally in the direction of freer trade um, and of eliminating the issues that are preventing free trade, and not in the direction of shutting down free trade. But we don't really know. Um, Global environmental policy, we have issues with ocean resources. How are they going to be shared? Ocean resources, how can they be shared sustainably? How can we prevent them from turning into an area where everyone fighting for resources depletes the resources? Um, Things like not just things like fishing resources, but also things like ocean mining, uh, and keeping the oceans clean. We're worried about endangered species, both for just the fact of being worried about the endangered species and biodiversity, but also preserving biodiversity means that we preserve the potential to find things like new medicines or new, even economic resources to do with some of these species, new food sources, new things from species we may not have even cataloged yet. And also the fact that if a species becomes extinct and it served a vital role in the ecosystem, it can cause the entire ecosystem to break down with negative consequences. And climate change. So this is a foreign policy issue for the United States. The current administration doesn't take climate change seriously in the same way the previous administration or the one two back, the Obama administration did. But I think that elements of the current administration do recognize that it's a real issue. But they do want to balance the issues of climate change with other issues like poverty reduction abroad and continued solid economic growth at home are also important considerations. And so balance is an important consideration for climate change. It is not a simple topic. It is not. It is not something where the alarmist point of view should be the only thing considered, and the consequences of changing policy to prevent climate change are not considered. Both need to be considered. And so it's a really complex area of foreign policy. And the unfortunate thing here is that the switch seems to be between extremes, instead of trying to find a reasonable solution that's going to actually be effective and that doesn't flip-flop every 4 years. So conclusion, presidency is a powerful institution. It's a critical role, and the president holds more individual power than any other single person. Does that mean the president holds more power than Congress acting together? No. He should have roughly equal power to Congress acting together. Does he have more power than a majority of Supreme Court justices acting together and the Supreme Court as a whole, as an institution defending itself? No. He should not have more power than the Supreme Court. He should have roughly the same power. A president who is out of control should be able to be controlled by a combination of the Supreme Court and the Congress and the elections, which are controlled by the state. The powers of the president have evolved over time. They have gotten consistently stronger with very little pushback. The small amounts of pushback have all rapidly been adapted to by the executive, and eventually the executive gets more power. Understanding the proper power of the presidency, the way that it's evolved over time, and the proper limits on the presidency are essential for civic engagement by American citizens. And it's really important for non-Americans to understand it if they're going to engage in civil engagement with Americans. That understanding the role of the president, the powers of the president, and the limits is really important for understanding the presidency, and for understanding engagement with the United States and even engagement with individual American citizens. Uh, so that is where I'm going to leave that, and we will come back with video 16 shortly.